Matt asked for a recap of last time, so maybe I'll briefly do that. So last session, Adam wasn't there, and we went off in a bit of a tangent. There were 2 weeks ago, we were discussing what you see on the boards in front of you. So we were talking about AGI timelines, short, medium, and long, and the responses of different groups of people to events that might shift them from one believing in one timeline to believing in another. We've kind of spent a fair bit of time talking about two of the groups. The two groups on the second set of boards that you see are tech leaders or insiders, so that's researchers, engineers, investors. And the second group were elites, so cultural, political, and economic elites. And we discussed, in a fair bit of detail how those first two groups, what we maybe think their current beliefs are, and what the shifts have been, and what they may be as various things start to happen. And we just started talking about the response of the public, where they are now, and what might change people's minds. That was 2 weeks ago. So there's some threads we'll pick up there. Last week, very much in the vein of, I suppose, the public view on AGI timeline shifting, one way into that is just to speak honestly about my internal thought processes around it and how it's affected my own view of my career and what I do. And that's, I think I've been thinking pretty hard about this for probably 5 or 6 years now, because I expected to be more or less where we are now. And I have expectations about what's going to happen over the next 10 years as well. And that was around, why do we do mathematics? What's our motivation for doing it? What gets us up in the morning? And more importantly, what keeps us doing it even though we're sacrificing other things we value in order to do it? So a lot of the difficult cognitive labor that people do, it's incentivized in various ways. I mean, outside of academia, there's a profit motive and various other motives. Inside academia, you're basically paying a significant opportunity cost to be in academia. If you're intelligent enough to have a position as a permanent, as a mathematician, you can probably go and do things that earn multiples of the salary you'd get in academia, with various other trade-offs. But you could make more money and have a easier life to some extent. So why do it? So I was discussing my thoughts around that. And how that's affected by the prospect of machines being able to do the parts of my job that actually are the things that motivate me to do it within some reasonable time frame. I'm not saying mathematicians, research level mathematicians, will necessarily be replaced in 5 years or something, but I don't think it's 50 years away. So that should make a difference if you're thinking about the contribution you make towards a field as being kind of cashed out over a very long time horizon, if you care at all about it being cashed out and it's not just some pursuit of intrinsic beauty. And even if it is a pursuit of intrinsic beauty, how do you feel about the situation where you're really playing in the kids' corner at some point? Is it still worth, spending time doing that, basically to satisfy your hedonistic impulses to just do pretty stuff when you could be spending time with your family or something else that you also value? So that was kind of the topic last time. Maybe that's a good place to jump off. I don't know if you got a chance to watch it, Adam, but what I just said probably gives you enough to go by. How has your updated timelines changed your motivational systems and how you value what you do, and how you think about adapting to those changes in your beliefs?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. I wouldn't say over the last 5 years, but certainly over the last 4 to 6 months. I think I've been taking the possibility that of a sharply accelerating trajectory for machine intelligence, artificial intelligence, in the ways that we've described it, up to and including the possibility of fully sentient, self-aware, sapient artificial general intelligence. We seem to be on a steeper trajectory than I would have imagined if if I think back to my earlier self, 3-5 years ago, so on, and I was fairly bullish back then. I mean, I've been following the space for 20 plus years, but I suppose the transformer and diffusion approaches have made very substantial leaps in progress, to not just in raw capability, but towards generality that I wasn't expecting. And so, yeah, I've been thinking about over the past 4 to 6 months, how should this affect my own career trajectory, but perhaps more interestingly for this discussion, how does it affect the research that my team does, that my organization does? How does it, what does that changing timeline do to our mission, for example? So I can speak a little bit about that. That's the first thing I thought I would open with. And then don't let me forget, there is, many years ago, I proposed a sort of, for fun, a blog post long ago, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago, a schema for thinking about, for one way to kind of think about how certain careers might be automated, like in what order and in what not order, but how might we think about the ways in which automation would roll out, given competing pressures and priorities. And so there's a 2x2 matrix that I offered for that. Maybe we can put that up and expand on it a little bit later. So that's, if we have time, we can get to that part of the thinking that I thought maybe I would share today. To start on my own personal thinking, and then that of my organization, which is an independent think tank, of course, and we are trying to understand the significance of technological change and the choices that societies now face as we are looking out into a future where we need to fully expect abrupt and impactful transformation of substantial portions of the global economy and some significant elements of social life as well, as a consequence of technological advancement. I mean, so that's disruption basically in a nutshell. And it's one thing to talk about energy, transportation, food, healthcare, education, those sorts of domains, and any narrower industry that falls under those sectors. It's one thing to talk about disruption of those things. That's sort of, in some sense, shallower. But the disruption of intelligence and intelligent labor, which is an input into virtually everything, it seems to me to be categorically different. So I'm still trying to figure out how this affects us. For me personally, it hasn't changed the way that I do research yet, but that feels like it's coming. So I think that we are probably over the course of the next 12 months, my team will start investing considerable time and energy looking at new AI tools that are available that will actually help us do our work. I know I'm aware of several things that are in early stages, and the possibility that I see is that these can mature very quickly. So the idea that you could have an AI research assistant, for example, that can read and digest literature very quickly, do fairly smart things about data gathering and simple analysis and so forth. I think it would be naive to expect to not be onboarding those tools within the next couple of years in a field like mine, if you want to stay relevant and at the cutting edge. I think that's almost a necessity. I suppose the alternative would be if you had a very, very large team, lots of junior staff. Imagine sort of an operation with lots of interns, for example, and you could throw smart people at your problems like that. Well, that would be a similar situation. But my organization isn't in that situation, and so we would sort of, what are we likely to do? Hire 10 junior researchers, or just license the AI research assistant software and everybody on the team starts using it? I'm guessing it's going to be the latter. So that's the first thing that's in practical terms. I think this technology is going to impact my workflow.
Did you see Galactica?
Ideally, sorry, go ahead.
Did you see this model
Say that
released?
again?
Did you see the news yesterday about Facebook and Papers with Code? They have a new thing they released called Galactica, which is a science assistant trained on some 40 million papers from across science and other areas, and you can ask it to like write a blog post about X, and it will do a reasonably good job. I tried it on an area of mathematics, and it looked pretty legit to me. So yeah, there's the descendants of that tool are definitely capable of doing some of the things you're describing. Maybe even that tool already.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't surveyed that space myself yet. So, and as you, I think you said it was yesterday. So this
Yes.
is a space that's. I mean, these things are happening fast and furious. It seems like every week something new is coming along. So yes, that these new capabilities will definitely be impacting my workflow and just personal process as a researcher going forward in the near future. This is not something that's 5 or 10 years away, but this is sort of imminent, I feel. And I'm kind of excited because I'm hoping it will make me smarter effectively. But we'll have to see. As a team and an organization, or rather, I suppose I should probably zoom out to the level of mission. The mission of my organization is pretty straightforward. It's to conduct research and perform analyses, develop and publish and widely disseminate findings about these new technology and its capabilities and the likely impacts those are going to have on our lives, on our economies, on our societies, and so forth, on specific industries, right down to individual sort of markets. And with forewarned being forearmed, with that knowledge, allowing us all to make better decisions about our future, where to invest, where to divest, and so forth. And I think that the overarching picture is that a new and much larger space of possibilities is opened up by these technology disruptions, as occurs with any new tool of any kind. Anytime a new tool, anytime a new technology, anytime new knowledge, and I define technology, I think I've defined it in here before, as practical knowledge. I define technology as a form of knowledge. Any knowledge or tool expands your degrees of freedom, right? It opens possible futures to you that were foreclosed before, and that possibility space expands. And the question is, how do you navigate that? And why? How and why do you navigate it? Or maybe why is not the right question. Is not the right way to look at it. But to what end? So given a set of goals or values that you're trying to realize or optimize or maximize or move towards, whatever they might be, as a new space of possibilities opens, the possible ways to navigate through that space to the end of maximizing or realizing whatever set of values you might have. That is that's what my organization is aiming at doing, is facilitating better navigation, so that we have more thriving and well-being, and less suffering and destructive behavior and so forth.
On that note,
along the way, on the journey.
So here's a question.
And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So RethinkX, what proportion is figuring stuff out, and what proportion is changing minds in terms of their relative importance? I mean, you do both, and maybe it's in the process of shifting. I infer putting more weight on the latter. But if you had to put a numerical figure to it, what percentage? I mean, you could have it could be useful to basically be 10-90, right? Like maybe there isn't so much stuff to figure out, but there's lots of minds that should be changed. or it could be the other way around. I'm curious because that seems to have some bearing on how AI tools and progress will impact the mission.
Sure, sure. Yeah, let me speak to that very quickly, and then I'll return and complete the thought that I had a second ago because it ties together with this. So to answer your question, I don't think it's linear, but it's the percentage went from uh, close to 100% just about the research and developing the insights in year one, which was 2017 for RethinkX, and it's probably closer to. I don't think we're at 1090 now, but it's probably closer. We're certainly past 50-50 at this point. Where and my role is. I mean, I suppose I've probably become. I've been.
You're a thought leader, Adam. That's where you've ended.
No, I've been promoted to my level of it's the Peter principle. I've been promoted to my level of incompetence. So I've been promoted upwards into a management position where I now direct the research team. I don't do as much of the research myself, and one of the reasons why is because it's now one of the responsibilities that I now have is in the dissemination domain, where we're trying to broadcast the information and the insights that we've generated. And again, the goal of the organization is not to sort of have all the answers and tell people and give people marching orders. That's not really it. The goal of the organization is to change the Overton window, to change the conversation about what is and isn't possible. And our mission has succeeded if we've gotten people to think and talk differently about what is possible for their future. And there's a valence to that. The valence is that with all these amazing possibilities, some of them are astonishingly beautiful and positive and bright in ways that many people with their existing window and view to the future don't see and are unduly pessimistic and so forth. Now, the way this wraps around to the issue of AI, I think, and AGI in particular, is that this mission has a finite life. There's a time frame on this. It's fairly short, right? I mean, if we are very busy telling everybody, well, these disruptions happen quickly. They don't take 50 years. They only take 10 to 15 years. And now I'm 5 years into this project, as it were. Well, I mean, I'm not going to be doing this forever, because the disruptions don't take forever, and that I've been screaming that from the rooftops. So there is a finitude to this entire project and to the mission. Now, you could say, well, there'll just be more disruptions following on afterwards, and we could carry on afterwards. But okay, maybe. But the big ones are these what we call foundational sectors, and the internet disrupted information and communications in a massive way. And information and communications are foundational sectors. You can think of them as one thing or separate, depending on how you want to look at it. But at any rate, the internet, in convergence with, of course, various computing technologies, and disrupted that foundational sector first, led by 20 or 30 years. Now, but historically, pretty much right on its heels, we have four foundational sectors coming. Three that fit into our schema: energy, transportation, and food. Okay, all simultaneously, pretty much right now. Energy a little bit sooner, food a little bit later, but basically all in another 20-year period or so. And now, then on top of that, you then have labor, if you want to think of that as a sector, which maybe that's not the right way to think about it. But we have labor potentially being disrupted by AI and automation. Okay, well, one of the things that we are arguing is that under these exceptional circumstances where these major foundational disruptions are all happening simultaneously, one of our arguments is that they are mutually catalyzing and accelerating. So they are, each of them individually is very likely going to proceed to unfold faster than in the context of the others than it would on its own, other things being equal. And so we haven't quantified that, but that's just that is a theoretical prediction. remains qualitative. We don't have a way to quantify that, but we would say something along the lines of, other things being equal, expect these disruptions to proceed even faster than your intuition might expect, because they are all accelerating one another. Clean energy accelerates clean transportation accelerates clean food, so on and so forth. Okay, well, throw AI and automation onto all of that, and it's like having a barbecue and then just backing up with a fuel tanker and just dumping gasoline on it. I can't imagine this is going to do anything except accelerate all of this. How could it not? And so, this is all a too long-winded way of saying that I now feel even more time pressure to get insights generated fast enough and then get them disseminated fast enough and widely enough to actually make a difference, because before it's too late. And by too late, I mean too late to make use of in making better decisions as opposed to worse decisions in the context of all of the transformation that we're experiencing. So if this is the main thing, I suppose, for right now, immediately right now, that the AI AGI acceleration has done for me. It has created a massive sense of urgency around all of the other work. And it wasn't like I didn't feel any urgency at all before, but now I feel like, oh my gosh, we have to, any insights that we are capable of producing, we better produce them really quickly, like within the next several years, or they're just not going to be useful. Mm-hmm. So that's the context in my own personal work and in the context of my organization.
Yeah, thanks. Do any of you in the audience have any comments on this topic? Maybe taking off from last week's seminar, if you were there or you watched it, or what Adam just said. Interested in other takes. Scary. Yeah. Well, obviously the solution, Adam, is that you should get a lot of people to deposit money into your crypto exchange and then gamble it in order to get resources to solve the problems quickly enough.
That's right. I just have to tell everybody all 16 billion are going to the effective altruism movement, and it'll all be fine.
So get on it. Just don't give it away too early. You might have to choose a different strategy now, but I'm sure you can come up with something. Yeah, all right. I don't think I have anything particular more to say in that direction, so maybe let's pivot back to some of the threads that we left hanging 2 weeks ago. If anybody has further comments on that, I'm interested to hear them. But okay, so over here on this board, I guess we started talking about public timelines, and I suppose that's in some sense what we've just been discussing with, I don't know if we're insiders or certainly not elites. Okay, so we talked about, maybe let's recap where we kind of thought the other groups were at. So on the fourth board here, there was I, L goes to M to S with a question mark. This is the insiders, who are kind of at least the influential subset, starting to move to shorter timelines. I think it's probably too simplistic to see what happened with FTX as being too much about short AGI timelines, but I think it's almost certainly part of the mix in terms of people's sense of urgency. I think you could read too much into that, and I think some people have, so I wouldn't want to put too much weight on that. But I do think that FTX. So the crypto exchange FTX just collapsed last week, or over the last week. So that includes the Future Fund and many philanthropic things downstream of FTX. And the founder of FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, has been going around talking about how it's important to gather lots of resources in order to solve existential risks. And one of those, as you know, that they funded is AI safety research. So there's, I don't know what weight to give it, but it's still quite surreal to be sitting here talking about how maybe like a financial event of the order of magnitude of tens of billions of dollars disappearing is partly the malfeasance that's going on there, to the degree it is malfeasance and not just incompetence, is at least partly a result of needing to go fast, and that speed is to do with the same kind of urgency that Adam is feeling. So, okay, again, maybe don't take that with a grain of salt with this particular event, but I do think it's appropriate to see this strangeness as a kind of marker of future strangeness. So one of the ways in which you'd expect the world to get weird over the next 10 years is that if people have widely diverging expectations about what the future looks like, and some of them think there are trillions or tens of trillions or hundreds of trillions of dollars to be allocated with immense productivity gains, then people will start making bets based on that. And if you think bubbles based on past expectations, like the internet boom, the possible resources to be freed up and productivity to be gained from AGI once it starts looking plausible or more plausible than it is already, the bets that people are going to make on that will look, all past bubbles look like a joke. So FTX will, I think, not seem so big compared to some of the stuff we're going to happen, and we're going to see in the next 5 years. Would be my prediction. So expect more of this. Okay, so so we talked about insider timelines, and maybe some of them are moving to short timelines. Elites maybe are starting to move from long to medium, meaning sometime, in a century, and medium. How did we define medium? Medium was having a median of 2040. Okay, and then the public. I don't have a good sense really of where the public is, I guess. I think probably mostly at long, but with punctuated by kind of being aware, like a kind of vague unease about things like stable diffusion. I don't know, I mean, everybody knows about sci-fi storylines about AIs taking over and doing nasty things and so on, but I feel like it's more or less completely divorced from expectations of daily life. I don't know, I'm interested in your opinions on that. What is the general normal view on to what extent this is going to change life over the next 20 years?
Well, I have one thought on this. It builds on something we talked about a couple of weeks ago, which is a couple of weeks ago we talked about how getting a hands-on experience with the new technology can awaken you to possibilities. And we mentioned a few examples, maybe some that we've had in our own lives. I certainly remember the first time I used an iPhone, and that was transformative. It just instantaneously felt like, oh, this is what the future of handheld computing and communications is. This thing, this smartphone. Even though it wasn't perfect, and it took a number of years before it realized its potential functionality. That was a transformative moment. I suggested several other examples. One would be when the first time a person sits in a car that drives itself. That is going to make automation technology feel very real and concrete in a way that the abstraction doesn't feel real. Even if it is real in evidence around a person, without that immediate, direct, firsthand knowledge and experience, they won't grok it. They won't really internalize the reality of it, I think. So we talked about that. I would like to add to the list of things we already, other examples: self-driving cars, generative art, and personal assistant. I would like to add, and this is maybe a little bit more pessimistic and dystopian, when people begin to realize they have lost their job to a machine, then that will be a remarkable waking up moment for anybody that happens to. And I think that it won't have to happen to very many people before that it becomes an explosive wave of transformation of public consciousness. Now, I think these things can happen together. For example, if you drive an Uber or a truck for a living in the United States or elsewhere, but in the United States, we have a lot of people who drive for a living, especially because of trucking, long distance trucking. When those people start seeing self-driving cars and they then lose their job to a machine, that will be, I think, a kind of pivotal or flashpoint, perhaps. And so that's another prediction of mine, is that in individual people's lives, loss of their jobs to machines will act like a flashpoint, and I think public sentiment could swing pretty rapidly if we have even a relatively small number of those examples. I don't know what those numbers would be, like what fraction of all jobs or what fraction of population, but it's probably a very small number before the fear drives a massive shift in consciousness towards fear, and then either expectation or concern that we're in a short scenario, the S scenario, as opposed to the L or the M scenario.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe I'll add another one here as well, which is to pick up something you said earlier about expected timelines for people losing jobs or what things will be automated first. I think it's pretty clear that a lot of, including my expectations, were more or less completely backwards. So for a long time, people expected things like mathematics or maybe even driving, mechanical operations to be automated first, but partly because there's just so much data of humans talking and generating images and doing other stuff on the internet, and we're much better at feeding text through these large models than anything else. It looks more likely that conversational AI or generative art, music and video, that these kinds of things will be commercialized first and reach a level of polish first, probably before things like self-driving cars reach very high reliability. So I would add to this list, I don't know how to phrase it exactly, but someone who values a kind of conversational relationship, like a friend with an AI. There are people like that already, right? I mean, there are kind of weirdos who really love talking to chatbots, even though they're extremely superficial. But that's going to change very rapidly. I don't know when this will be, but I think it feels to me a bit like just before internet dating really started. Like, you sort of know something is technically possible, but the community consensus is that it's for weirdos and only freaks would do it. The public perception around internet dating is one of the advantage of being an old person, Adam, like us, is that you see things just go through these stages, and it makes you aware of how rapidly and profoundly people's views on things shift. It's just like,
oh yeah,
when we were young, it was just like, first of all, there was no internet, and then when there was internet, it was obviously crazy. You're just asking to get have something bad happen to you to date someone over the internet or to start a relationship.
Oh my God, geez. I mean, of course, we can remember when it was crazy to think anybody would ever buy anything on the internet. Yeah. Like, I mean, use your credit card to pay something for something on a website? Are you nuts? You're just going to get robbed blind.
Yeah, it's more or less like the same category as replying to an email from a Nigerian scammer or something.
Oh yeah, I mean, in the early 1990s, that's exactly how it felt, and maybe with good reason too. I mean, those were primitive days. but yeah, I think well, this is actually a good place if you don't mind. If we can find a place on the board, maybe
Yeah.
on the board I'm looking at on the right hand side, to draw up the schema that I proposed a number of years ago.
Uh-huh.
And it's dated now, but let's at least put it up there because it's old thinking, but maybe it'll be interesting. And that is, what occupate how to think about occupations that are threatened by automation. And I was thinking purely in terms of automation in the past. In other words, by narrow artificial intelligence, not by general, whether sentient or non-sentient artificial intelligence. I was thinking, strictly speaking, by algorithmic narrow AI. But at any rate, okay, so it's two axes, and you can think of it in four quadrants: high, low, and high, low, right? Okay, so the two axes, it doesn't matter which way around you put them. The two axes to draw are, maybe I can do it myself. Well, I'll let you do it because you've got the stylus. The two axes are uh, uh, the barriers to entry of the occupation, okay, on the one axis. And you can think of that as sort of the educational or skill requirement, or in broadly, and perhaps you could, because we're talking about AI, you can think of the quote unquote intelligence requirement, but that's probably misleading. And I'll explain why in a second using the example of drivers, right? So we used to think, well, I mean, any bozo can drive a cab, can drive a taxi. No, it actually takes a massive amount of intelligence, and it's a much harder thing to solve than, for example, well, many other things that have fallen to automation sooner than driving vehicles. Okay, so we have to be careful about how we use that term intelligence, but certainly barriers to entry and educational attainment requirements. So how many degrees you have and so forth. Okay, that's on the one axis. And you can think of that, you can break it into low and high there. And then on the vertical axis, as you've drawn it, is the stakes of the stakes of the occupation. In other words, and and when I originally wrote about this, I used the word stakes specifically because it's not just about risk, it's also about reward, right? So if the stakes are low, then there may not be all that much of a priority to automate quickly. Whereas if the stakes are very high, in other words, if either there's potential for catastrophic loss, death, dismemberment, permanent injury, so forth, and especially anything that might scale. And on the flip side, if there's potentially huge reward or payout, then the stakes are very high, right? Okay, so now we can take those four quadrants and we can put occupations in there. And you can say, well, it's interesting because there are occupations that fall in all four of those quadrants. And the place, and the reason why I thought this was sort of interesting originally when I published this in maybe 2014 or 15, something like that, was that it's not intuitive, right? So like you can think of like driving a car. The barrier to entry is low, but the stakes are actually high. And Tesla has, for example, learned this the hard way, right? It's to make a safe self-driving car is extremely difficult because driving is freaking dangerous, right? You're a 2-ton steel and metal box moving at 80 miles an hour. It's an absolute death trap. But the barrier to entry to that occupation, to driving, is very low. Okay, so because the stakes are high, the incentive to automate this sooner rather than later is there. Also, the reward is huge, right? So whoever succeeds in automating driving is going to realize it's ungodly return on their investment, and it scales, right? So you crack this once, and then there are literally hundreds of millions of vehicles in the world to be driven. So
maybe we should be clear that
scales very large.
The axes aren't really symmetric. So we're thinking in the context of automation, the barriers to entry is kind of for the human, not for the person seeking to automate it, right? And then the stakes you're kind of thinking about, well, I suppose it's both in the way you just described it. Both the stakes for the person who succeeds in automating it and also for the person currently doing it, those seem like rather different stakes somehow. Which one do you mean by this vertical axis?
Yeah, I guess I'm being a little sloppy in both of these. Originally, I think if I again think back to my earlier self, I think my original perspective was I was coming at this from the point of view of we were trying to imagine which occupations, which jobs were vulnerable to automation first. Like which were the things that were going to go first, which were things that are going to get automated, which jobs were the robots coming for first, and who should prepare to get to be technologically unemployed. And so it was very much from the human perspective. It really wasn't through the lens of the AI technology itself that I was thinking of this in terms of barriers to entry. Um, so that's how I was thinking about this. In terms of the stakes, yeah, I'm just a little sloppy. You could really have multiple axes here. I've sort of sloppily condensed them down into a single dimension, but with this word stakes, which is a kind of a weasel word. You really should probably break it out in terms of risk and reward and a few different dimensions there that are not necessarily perfectly overlapping and correlated, but might be somewhat orthogonal. But at any rate, this was thinking from quite a while ago. But I think that the barriers to entry part was what was originally interesting, because people were thinking that it would be the quote unquote low skill jobs that would be automated most easily and most quickly. And when I started looking at it this way, it became clear to me that that's not necessarily the case. That intuition seemed like it was likely to prove false. And I think it has. But I don't know if this is, again, this is old. I don't know if this is still useful to us. But I can put a few things, or we can put a few things in these quadrants, and then maybe that'll help us, at least stimulate some conversation.
Yeah, maybe we should distinguish between, this term low skill hides a lot of complexity. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the observation you're making is that you might have an idea of low skill in physical labor, as in you don't need a lot of cognitive ability or sort of training in terms of thought processes in order to perform the job, versus, you could also say there's cognitive labor that's relatively low skilled. And it, from the point of view of today's systems, it does seem that what we think of as low skilled in terms of it's a physical operation. Some people, probably nobody who's really familiar with how trucking works would look at it and say it's particularly low skilled. You're driving a very large vehicle, and there's the whole video games about driving trucks, and they're full of complexity and so on. But we're just very good at these physical activities because of our hardware platform. So they look low skill to us, but these are in some sense quite difficult activities for the machines who are coming from a very different universe somehow. Whereas the cognitively low, let's not say low skilled, but some things we tend to think of as being fairly clever are in fact highly automatable. Things like apparently what stable diffusion does. That's what you're getting at, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, you're going to add some things to the table. What are we adding?
Yeah, so think about things that are low. Let's just go sort of around around the table there. So something that's low stakes and also low barrier to entry from the human perspective. Let's stick with that, because that's how I have these things drawn in here originally. So if your barriers to entry as a human employee, as a human worker, are low and the stakes are low, what would those sorts of jobs be? That would be things like being a cashier, working retail, doing janitorial or custodial services, landscaping, and other things that we might call menial labor. In other words, labor that doesn't require masterful 1,000 hour, 5,000 hour, 10,000 hour skill building to become employed and competent in. So this doesn't include things like being a carpenter or a plumber or builder or anything like that. These are all really junior positions that most humans could do. Okay, so that's that category. You could imagine
Maybe just to anticipate a criticism, I want to say, and I know you agree, that uh, nothing about what we just said or will say is meant to look down on people in any way, and it's kind of a mistake of our civilization that we judge people in some like with some moral valence, depending on the work they do, and this is something we should and have to get over very quickly. So this is not. There's nothing better intrinsically about a doctor or a lawyer versus someone who works in retail. They just have a job that requires more training.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the temptation there is to construct a a highly moralized meritocratic hierarchy around employment and occupations, and there are all kinds of philosophical problems with doing that. Not and that's just leading up until now, and then of course going forward, many of these philosophical concerns become very much real world practical problems when you have the specter of artificial general intelligence looming, right? Because no human is going to be competent compared to AGI, especially super intelligent machines, right? We're all going to be to a first approximation equally useless. And the difference between somebody with a fancy pants job and somebody with a quote unquote menial job or redneck job or anything like any of those derogatory terms that we use, those are going to seem hopelessly quaint and very much misguided in the context of hyper competent, super intelligent machines. And so we need to it would behoove us to get ahead of that curve on that, if you ask me. But yes, I completely agree with you, Dan. We're not trying to denigrate or derogate any of these positions. We're simply just offering a bit of a schema. And again, I'm putting those skill requirements and intelligence in that axis in scare quotes. The main thing is that there are barriers to entry from the perspective of employers and employers and employees in the real world economy. Now, you can let's go to the right, because this is interesting. You can imagine that there are jobs where the barriers to entry are very high. In other words, they require much more training, much more time, perhaps more degrees and qualifications and so forth. But the stakes, both in terms of risk and in terms of reward, are not necessarily high. And you laugh, you're writing in exactly the things that I had there. I had scholars and poets and writers and musicians and artists and all of the things that are in that quadrant where life and limb are not at risk, right? Life and limb are not at risk. And yet there can be very, very high barriers to entry into those occupations and professions. That is the sort of thing that I was thinking. That's the sort of thing that goes in there. Yes, exactly. And if you want to, if you want to deride anybody, well, you can look around the chart and see who really deserves credit and who really deserves a bit of scorn. Okay. Let's go to the top left quadrant.
Sorry, now. Adam, you stepped a little bit over and the orb cam swung. So yeah, thanks. That's good.
Is that good?
Yep.
Okay, so go to the top left quadrant here. Now the barrier to entry is low, but the stakes are high. Okay, well, it's surprisingly there are a lot of jobs that are in this domain, and this is where people are sort of woefully underappreciated and exploited. So driving is definitely in there, because although the barrier to entry to that occupation is low, the stakes are very high, especially risk to life and limb. Other examples include things like food preparation. So people who work in a restaurant, right? You can't be cavalier. You have to be hygienic and safe with people's food. And there are a number of positions that are like, I think, that where the barrier to entry is fairly low, but nevertheless, the individuals involved are taking a serious risk and responsibility and threat of culpability onto themselves in those occupations, and they're often not nearly compensated well enough. So, for example, teachers are in this quadrant because right? So, and oh my goodness, especially teachers and caregivers of young children, and also perhaps the elderly, where the stakes are enormously high. Your child's entire future, not to mention their life and limb, are in a person's hands who is typically grossly undercompensated compared to other occupations, especially the ones that we're going to, that are on the right hand side of this, that have high barriers to entry. Okay, so now the top right, the top right quadrant are the more stereotypical professions, right? So these are things where there's a high barrier to entry and there are high stakes. So these are your surgeons and your brain surgeons, your rocket scientists, people who are building things that can't fail, or people die, people who are providing services, and that includes people like lawyers, where a good lawyer will keep you out of prison, a bad lawyer won't, or keep you from going bankrupt or being ruined, for example. So an architect has to be highly skilled to design a building that's safe, and engineers vehicles that are safe, and so forth. So these are sort of your stereotypical professions. Anyway, this was the schema. That's it. I don't know if this is useful to our conversation or not, but if I dial my thinking back almost a decade, this was what was on my mind. And again, I think over the last decade, what's been very surprising is which things have fallen already or begun to fall to automation and AI. Things I wouldn't have expected, like things in the bottom right quadrant. But one could imagine that the pressure is not equally present on all of these occupations, because the reward or the avoidance of risk from the perspective of an employer is not there. Whereas you could imagine enormous value to automating all of the jobs in the top half, regardless of the barriers to entry, the top half of the space we've got mapped out here. Anything with very, very high stakes, if you can automate that, you can lower your risk, and on the flip side of that, increase your probability of obtaining a scalable, very large or scalable reward, if you could automate these things. Yeah, so I don't know if that helps our conversation, but we could talk about, which of these things do we really think are amenable to automation in light of all the recent developments since I originally thought of this schema. Which things are really likely to go, which things are going to be last to go. That would be another question to ask, like which if any of these jobs are going to be safest for longest.
Yeah, maybe that's a good segue of bringing back the relevance to individuals thread that Rowan asked about some weeks ago. What does all this mean for me in making choices about careers or just what to do? Yeah, choosing something that's above the high tide mark for as long as possible is probably high on the list of things to think about when choosing careers in the near future, I would say.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's tricky. I think here I have to bring back in a topic you've mentioned many times, Adam, which is the way I would put it is that as at a phase transition, some quantities sort of go to infinity. So when you have a disruption, it may be that some jobs are being automated, but a new market is growing in size so rapidly that even if a certain job is being automated, if the demand is going to infinity, then actually there might be more people needed to do that job temporarily, or at least an allied job may suddenly require many, many people. So I think I'm quite uncertain about the demand for programmers, for example. So it's quite interesting to reflect on the wage premium for programmers in, say, the United States over the last several decades, because it's superficially easy to say, well, of course programmers are highly paid, but it's not that obvious, right? I mean, the programming, software engineering is a job that's been around now for decades. People see the wage premium, so they do those degrees, and there's certainly a large increase in the number of people doing computer science. Maybe it flattened out 10 or so years ago, but it increased very rapidly. But the wage premium remained, which wasn't what a lot of people were predicting. And that seems to be a consequence of just, well, software eating the world, as Mark Andreessen would say, right? Even though there's a lot of people going into programming as a career, the domain of application of that job is growing more rapidly, at least judging by the wage premium, than the number of people going into it, even as that increases very rapidly itself. So that complicates these kinds of predictions to the point where it seems very hard to me to really predict things with a fixed, like, unless things that are sort of scaled to the population, say radiology, right? The number of people breaking bones or needing x-rays is roughly proportional to the population and their health and the risks they're taking. And unless the population starts increasing again rapidly, which may happen, but doesn't seem to be going to happen. I mean, that's a very slow process by definition, almost. So the demand for radiology probably isn't going to change unless there's some new reason to take an x-ray. But that does seem, maybe not immediately, but over time will be pretty subject to automation, at least large parts of it. So there's things like that where you can fairly confidently predict that is not going to be a smart career. But some of these things like programming or teaching is another one, right? So you could certainly, actually, my son goes to synthesis school, which is some online kind of class. And they just emailed us this morning about a new AI tutor they're trialing. Okay, so today in the code seminar, I'm going to be implementing an AI bot that'll stand in MediUni and you can talk to it. And that kind of technology is going to be widely used for tutors and teachers, and we will scale the automation of teaching and tutoring like crazy over the next 5 years. But still, maybe there's even more demand for teachers because we shift our civilization to actually giving a shit about teaching in a way that we don't currently. So that it just may be that we choose to spend a lot of human resources on it, even more than we do now. So maybe teaching actually is a more desirable and well-paid profession than it is today. So I really find it difficult to give advice on, careers. I don't know what your take is on that, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, I think my take is very similar to yours. The one thing that I would add there is that there seem to me to be occupations that have relationships, the full complexity and dynamics of human social relationships embedded in them. In other words, they are personal rather than impersonal services. And a teacher is a great example of that. Other sort of ones that are commonly mentioned are things like coach, therapist, and so on, where it may be more difficult. Now, again, not impossible necessarily. I mean, you were mentioning earlier the relationships that people have with chatbots, but it may be the case that fulfilling the entire the full bandwidth channel of a human to human personal relationship is takes longer and is more difficult for AI, especially that isn't sentient, to supplant. And so I think I can imagine a scenario where we very dramatically humanize a lot of occupations that have been under pressure to dehumanize for a long time. And these are occupations in some instances that may be very old. They may extend deep into history, and that were dehumanized relatively recently. And it might be fun to imagine that they might be rehumanized. And the optimist in me and the sentimentalist in me thinks that a lot of things might be like that. We might go back to spending more care, more time, and more attention on each other and on small things that we once maybe took more time and care with in the past. Um, so yeah, I mean, and so teaching is a good example. Uh, but even so take something like landscaping. I mean, there are people who really enjoy just the time and the solitude, maybe in some instances, sometimes it's the social dimension of being very meticulous about caring for things. Gardening is an example, right? And yes, you could automate gardening fully and get the result, but the final result is not identical to the entire process and the experience of doing the work of that occupation and then enjoying the final result at the end of it. And it could be that more work will be treated with that sort of depth and care, and perhaps built into one's identity and experience, as opposed to just being alienated and turned into toil and drudgery. And I think there are cultural examples around the world where this is the case. That in my own family, because I'm married to a person of Japanese ancestry, I'm a little bit familiar with Japanese culture, and more traditional Japanese culture, and still somewhat today, does provide instructive examples for how to take a great deal of care in seemingly small and mundane things, like preparing a cup of tea or working in the garden. And it might be that there could be a general shift in our in humanity's posture towards work than as a result of the rapid and widespread automation of lots and lots of occupations. So we'll see. So there's that to think about as well. Those two things: our personal investment in the work, and then also our interpersonal relationships. If that content, which has been driven out of a lot of occupations, maybe could return to them or expand within them, within those occupations that still have that dimension to them. So.
There's a few comments in the chat I'll just read out to inform the discussion. Yeah, so Matt points out that people have been talking about disruption in education for a long time. It may be different this time, maybe not. And Rowan made a good point, which is that less people with jobs rather, might reduce the need for professional teachers, since parents will play that role. Yeah, I can say that's personally happening in my family. So we are basically choosing to homeschool Russell. And it's only possible because of, first, the internet and online tutors, and more and more of a role of AI tools as well, I expect, over time. Otherwise, we simply wouldn't have the time to do it. And it does mean that we spend more time with him than we would otherwise. So I think that whether it's remote work or AI tools, the coming disruptions will allow people to resolve coordination problems that were only possible to solve in a certain way before. So I think we'll see a lot of that, where it's not even slight changes in what's possible can cause new solutions to coordination problems across many people and many different aspects of life, open up new solutions that are really quite different. So that's, of course, where new occupations come from, I suppose, right? After disruptions, it's just that the landscape of things that people want done will change as people live differently. So there's a much larger market in the future for online tutors than existed in the past, simply because a lot of people will start doing what we're doing, already are. So this is one way in which that's not only AI, but things will change. And Matt is commenting that, yeah, maybe we should, well, I'll give it a spin. Maybe we shouldn't be too keen to just go do gardening and let AIs run the world. Maybe that's not the optimal outcome for human beings. Depends depends how serious the gardening is. Maybe I tend to think of my role at Meta Uni as, uh, as more like a gardener than anything. I don't know that it's
Well,
not optimal. Hmm.
one of the things that is always a danger in a conversation like this, um, is the what I in a paper, Dan, I'm sure you remember it, wrote it a number of years ago. I talked about some of the what I called informal fallacies, so sort of consistent flaws in problems, recurrent errors, I think, in thinking. One of them was the arrival, what I call the arrival fallacy, and that's the idea that that we're going to arrive at some point in the future, and that's what the future is going to be like. And even if we tell ourselves, well, that won't be like that forever, the thinking is still, well, we're going to arrive, and then there'll be some stasis, there'll be something static. We'll be in some homeostatic condition, something relatively stable for a while. And I think that's kind of a dangerous assumption to make. It may be within some domains there's some truth to that, but for example, in all of this, we're still thinking, well, AGI is going to arrive, and then how are the jobs going to change, and then what are we going to do? And so that may be perfectly fair, and if Sam Altman is right, and there isn't sort of a hard takeoff of AGI, and it's a little bit slower than we imagine, especially if it's not sentient, then okay, fair enough. People are still going to have to have a job. They're still going to have to work. It isn't going to be overnight that societies are going to be wealthy enough to start paying out, $10,000 a month UBIs, and so that all of the humans in the society can immediately retire and go about their leisure and so forth. We know that that's not going to be the case. But I think nevertheless, we should probably be pretty cautious, because the time between, sort of some sort of takeoff, an AGI arriving, and then something closer to, getting past the foothills of the singularity to the actual fucking singularity, is probably not going to be that long. I mean, I'm thinking 10 years at 15 at the outside. And, that's, even in my life, that's more than twice as long as my adult working life now. Basically, I've been working for more than 30 years. I've been working since I was 15. And so, I mean, that's not very long, if that's really the case. And then if everything becomes moot after that, whether nobody's working or jobs don't even mean anything, and people are mostly in the metaverse, if that's a thing, or people are merging cybernetically with with artificial super intelligences, you'll get all the singularity stuff, right? So anyway, I just want to dial it back to to reframe it. Whereas, what am I trying to say here? What I'm trying to say is all of this conversation needs to have an end date to it. We need to recognize that whatever happens with the things that we're talking about here, this is only even applies to maybe a 20-year, 25-year period, and then it's out the window anyway. And with that in mind, then that just in itself ought to shape the conversation a bit, right? Because it's not like we're talking about landing here in some new condition and then, okay, we're going to be there for 3 or 4 generations, and we need to really figure out how to organize accordingly around it. That is not on the cards.
Yeah, I think that's right. And implicitly, if we're talking about safe jobs, the way I think about it is there'll be an interim period. I mean, okay, if things go very badly, we're all just dead. If there's a kind of quasi-utopia on the other side, or at least some very rich state and UBIs, and things are kind of okay or very good, still the interim period, you don't want to lose your job in the next 5 years. Nobody's going to come and help you, right? You'll just not have a job, and if you're American, you'll just be left to die in the streets.
Right.
Sorry about that.
No, don't apologize. Too many of us feel that way.
So, okay, then it makes a difference whether you get on the right boat now, right? So there'll be an interim period where things are going to be very rocky. Things are going to change very rapidly. There'll be a lot of negative responses, people pushing this way and that way. It's going to be chaotic and difficult and maybe dangerous. Then we come out the other side and things will be it won't last forever, but you want to be in a good spot for this period. And I suppose my own career choices and movements and decisions over the last 5 years have more or less been largely around that, in the name of not wanting to put on the rubbish heap at some point. We've got about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and we should move on to the tea break. I want to show you. There's a new building here at MediUni, and I want to show you what that looks like. Maybe let's talk a bit more about this safe jobs idea. I was thinking, I'm reading a new book by Ross Garnaut about superpower, the sort of idea of transforming the Australian economy along the lines of the opportunity in renewable energy. And yeah, so here's an idea. I want to see what you think about it. It's not like the robot manufacturing computernium world will arrive instantly, right? Even if that's the direction we're going with, very capable, widespread robotics, etc., etc. It will need a lot of energy, and maybe eventually the robots build and install all the solar panels and design and build and install all the power cables and all that. But that isn't coming in 5 years, I don't think. So as this transformation progresses, the demand for energy and raw inputs into this growing technological marvel / horror will be intense. So anything feeding into those inputs will be pretty safe and I would think highly valued for some time. So, for example, there's a lot of jobs that are going to exist in Australia building out renewable energy, not only the hardware and the engineering, but also the coordination and management and designing all those markets and making sure they run well. And there's books, including the one I just cited, which will tell you those kinds of careers, which are, several of my students and others I know have gone into those kinds of jobs. Those seem to me like relatively safe because the demand for energy, whatever's going to happen, I mean, even in a scenario where there's no AGI, it's going to go up like crazy. And if we are running all these AIs in data centers and they have ideas for all sorts of amazing new things to do, the demand for energy will be even higher. So I would say that kind of infrastructure and everything surrounding it is kind of going to be a bottleneck and therefore something that's highly valued. I would say the same about coding, actually. Machines are very rapidly making progress on coding. I think there's an estimate. I don't know which organization it was, but so Google cited its internal version of the GitHub Codex model as increasing programmer productivity across the organization by 6%. So this is using models that write code for you, basically. 6% is a lot. Productivity growth of 6% in a year at a company the scale of Google is nothing to sneeze at, and more is coming. So a lot of programming is getting automated already.
And I would just add to that, one presumes that the quality of software engineers at Google is very high relative to the industry and global average. And my naive intuition would be that the better the software engineer, the closer they already are to some optimal amount of performance. So the idea that you could get a 6% premium on top of a Google engineer is pretty amazing. If it were, it were the engineers who write the code for certain services in my city, for example, well, I can imagine giving them a bigger boost than that with even a tiny little bit of AI help. Poor guys are struggling a bit, but in a place like Google, that's astonishing. That's astonishing.
And these models as they currently exist make many mistakes. They have many issues. For example, they're just copy and pasting code out of open source libraries that shouldn't be copied and pasted, and so there's a whole bunch of issues around them, and they're quite flawed in their current incarnations and so on. But there is no reason to expect they won't become much better. And I think it's more a comment on actually most programming work being much more mundane, repetitive, and pretty low cognitive labor than you might think. So, I mean, the Google engineers I know spend probably half their time just plugging things into each other with proto buffers. They're just chugging data around from this thing to that thing and doing some pretty boring, repetitive transformations, and it's not that much of a surprise that you can automate a lot of that. But given that it's going to be automated, why does it nonetheless seem to me fairly safe in the short term? Well, the leverage and power of somebody who can marshal the resources that the AIs will provide, which will start off in the digital world and the world of code, the opportunities that will be unlocked by that will make the opportunities in software deployment over the last few decades look pretty small in comparison, I would say. Right? So at least that's one of these phenomena where the automation is happening at the same time as the scope of the activity is expanding by an order of magnitude. So I think that for some time, still these will be pretty safe and high-valued jobs. Can you think of others, Adam, or anybody else?
Well, just a quick counterpoint to that. We'll throw back to a couple of weeks ago. We were talking in our conversation about how I think the example we used then was chess. How humans plus AI were for a brief moment more capable than AI alone, but that didn't last very long, is my understanding. And so I do wonder if we don't want to fall into the trap of assuming that same sort of thing. That seemed to be and I think you had some funny ways that you described that. It was sort of the copium of our age or something like that, I think is how you described it. So we want to make sure that aren't making that same mistake with software engineering and tools like Codex, because it may be that is just a very unstable equilibrium. That condition doesn't last very long. But I can't speak to software engineering because I have so little experience in direct contact with that. But I tell you what, maybe here's a useful. How about this as a useful shorthand for making predictions about other occupations that might be amenable? Okay, think of occupations today, or tasks even. Never mind occupations, which is an occupation is a whole cluster of organized tasks together. But you could think of it as you could break it down into individual or tasks and subtasks if you want. But anyway, let's stick with occupations. Okay, imagine a line of work or an occupation that you do today that for which it would be, or it is really helpful to have a second human being there giving you a hand, right? So there are many things that are like that, where two heads are better than one. We often say we have expressions, we have idioms for capturing that sort of thing, or it's nice to have an extra pair of hands, that kind of thing. We have these expressions. Well, perhaps there will be a time, who knows for how long exactly, but in some interim period where AI, and then one would imagine AI instantiated in some sort of general purpose robotic platform, whether it's an anthropomorphic robot or not, who knows? But one could imagine machines basically being able to step into that role of helper or assistant or just partner or peer, to do work or achieve tasks or pursue goals that we do currently do maybe in formal occupations, maybe even just hobbies, whatever it is, where it's really, really helpful to have another person there giving you a hand, or maybe even two people there giving you a hand, helping you out. And if that were the case, we could think through that lens and ask that question. Well, right now it's really great if you're a master plumber to have an assistant with you on site, because sometimes you really just need 4 or 5 hands and not just 2 to get even if the robot is literally like just standing there holding a wrench within your reach while you're on your back upside down under a sink or something like that. That could be really helpful. So I can imagine a number of situations that are something like that. And this is a little ways out. This is not in the next 5 years, but in the next 15 years, I can imagine people putting machine labor to use in that sort of I want to say constructive, but sort of additive, as opposed to in an additive way, as opposed to in a replacement way. So you get sort of a non-zero outcome as opposed to sort of a zero outcome, exchanging human for machine labor outcome. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that does. Yeah, I think your comment and Rowan's making a comment that I'll read in a similar way. Regarding coding, I think he's saying it might be helpful to distinguish the task of writing code from the broader design and engineering process. And I think that's a good point. So, especially at the scale of something like Google, the task of implementing a new product or feature is, I don't know what percentage, but if you think about the number of hours that go into it and the team and what they're doing in any given moment, it's maybe half code or less, right? A lot of what they're doing is coordinating across the organization, figuring out what to do, what is necessary, and it's a lot of process goes around, also checking that it's doing the right thing and putting in place automated systems that will verify it, and all of that is not necessarily coding. And that part, figuring out what to do, it'll be, we'll be automating low-level coding and medium-level coding sometime before the AI can run a company and just figure out what product to make, right? So I do think that, and you can see it already with the new capabilities of language models have led to a large number of startups that are trying to exploit those abilities to do new and interesting things. And that AI tutor I just mentioned from Synthesis would be one of those. So that's a place where humans will find a lot of value at the cutting edge for some time, right? That's taking these new capabilities and kind of running with them at the level of design and coordination and all of that.
Let me describe a sort of a counterpoint, or flip that, invert that a bit. I don't know, maybe this is silly or it's too narrow, but let me give it a shot anyway. So I can imagine a situation where today I would pay an expert, like an architect or a design. I'm going to give you a narrow example of home improvement. Okay, so today, if I wanted to do some home improvement, some project to home improvement on my home, remodel the bathroom, expand the kitchen, fix something in the backyard, whatever. There's a design and engineering sort of dimension to that, and then there's the implementation of the design by what in the United States we call contractors, and those would be carpenters and builders and people with different sets of specific expertise. If you're remodeling a bathroom and a kitchen, you would need plumbing and electrician, and that kind of thing. Now, if you're handy, or reasonably handy, or just foolish, and I'm foolish. I won't say handy, but I'm foolish. And masochistic, and you enjoy doing that kind of work yourself. And you can save a boatload of money too, because that expert labor, plumbers, electricians, and so forth, are very expensive to the end user, certainly. Then the service that I hire in is the design. That's the service that I hire in, and then I implement the grunt work myself, for better or worse. And I could imagine getting the design work from an AI, right? And then still doing the quote unquote hard part myself. So I don't know if that is exactly the same or if that's somehow the opposite of what you were talking about with design of software being safer or less amenable to AI. But anyway, I'm just giving a kind of maybe a parallel but somehow inverted or bizarro world example alternative to what you're talking
Yeah,
about. Um,
I think
so
that, I
yeah,
mean,
I don't know if that
there.
makes sense or not.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Except if you were trying to design a kind of building that had never been built before, or an exotic music hall with some amazing sound properties, you're probably not going to get that. I mean, the plan for your new bathroom, you can probably get an AI to make that, or even your house if it's following fairly standard lines. But yeah, I get that's an implicit point in what I was saying about design and coordination. If you're making a new product or a new company, if it's a problem that really doesn't have a lot of precedent, you for some time you won't be able to get the AI to just generate a reasonable solution to that problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to move over to the new building in a moment. Oh, wait, yes, we're waiting. AI can't invent stuff. That's not what I said. For some time, it'll be much cheaper and easier to get the AI to write code that's mostly been written before, come up with ideas that's interpolating between things that already exist. It will be somewhat later where the AI is saying, here's a business idea, the people you should hire, and the architectures you should use, and then directs the staff to implement it or the AIs to implement it. That's a timing claim. Yeah, that's right. I absolutely think that's coming. All right, we want to wrap up this discussion for this week. Are there any final comments? I mean, we can continue to discuss, but maybe this is the end of the sort of more formal part of the discussion. And we'll move over and have a look at this building, and we can keep chatting and take questions. Are there any final comments you want to make, Adam, before we do that?
No more comments for me. This is very interesting. Thanks.
Cool. All right. So if you want to detach from the orb and follow me, everyone. So if you can see it already from up here if your draw distance is sufficiently high. You can see it in the distance on the other side of the knot over there. So that's where we're headed. There's a building. Yeah, so this is a piece of architecture that we bought off a Robloxian choral rhyme. So I didn't build this. This is much beyond my abilities in Roblox Studio for now and probably forever. I don't know how long this took. Hopefully we'll have a chance to kind of ask some questions of Corval Rhyme at some point. Yeah, it's definitely more demanding over here. Hopefully, I mean, I hope it didn't feel too laggy when you were back over on the peak. Did it? Does the performance of TRS feel any different to usual? No. Yeah, okay. So that's because of game streaming. So that's this is made up of many parts, this building, but when you're over on the peak, you shouldn't feel any influence of them. So yeah, I don't know to what extent. I mean, performance is important, so I don't want to put boards in here and then have them be really slow if you're using them, for example. But I can imagine using these environments for some things. So I'll show you the lecture hall if you follow me. So in the past, we've kind of not used indoor environments, as I've said before, partly because I just really hate seeing people talk about the metaverse or virtual worlds and then stick people in the like some very one-to-one reproduction of the terrible building that they have in the real world, as though there's no opportunity to do something different in a virtual world. But having said that, you know, sometimes it is cool to be indoors and gives a different vibe to things. So we're interested in exploring that. For example, it's kind of cool to look out the window at the world. I think. Yeah, I don't know that the audio is any different in here. I haven't noticed that. Um, I think the on the roadmap for audio in Roblox is they want audio to behave differently in indoor spaces and to bounce off surfaces in a different way and all that. But so yeah, talking about future jobs, virtual architect seems like a cool job to me. Building virtual spaces that
Yeah.
make people more productive.
Yeah, holy moly! And the sky is the limit. Like your imagination. I mean, even not even your own imagination is the limit because, of course, your imagination is going to be assisted by by the the AIs that are powering, the DALI 2s and stable diffusions and mid journeys of tomorrow and so forth. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of astonishing to imagine what will be possible to produce. Yeah, it's. I think I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago. I am going to have to go back and see. I have to dig up whatever that Star Trek, the Next Generation episode was, where the children were sort of effortlessly producing stuff just by imagining it with these tools that were cheating. They were shortcut. I have to see. I don't remember what lecture the Enterprise crew gave to them about to these people about how it was the wrong thing to do. I don't know how well that logic's going to hold up now that it's basically a reality, or we're very, very close to it. But at any rate, it's the potential for for just unleashing creativity, and then explosively growing the space of possible experiences that people can have is amazing. I mean, that's the promise. The beauty and the utopian, magnificent vision of the metaverse, right? Is there's no limits. It's just your imagination. People have been talking about this for a long time. William Gibson and Philip K. Dick going back a long way, and then of course the Matrix exploded the possibility into the public imagination. And more recently, we've got other media and popular entertainment versions of virtual worlds, and we're now looking at seriously creating them. But it really is about it's about what you can create and who you can be and what experiences you can have in these environments, right? And that's it's almost I think when I sorry to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, but when I first was following the news about NFTs and the metaverse, I found that very discouraging, and it struck me as very dystopian. And I think it maybe a lot of people felt the sort of similar way, because instead of opening a new door onto experiences and things that you could be, it was just more of what you could own and what you could have and possess, and that was just so stomach churning to me. Very antithetical to what I've always dreamed the metaverse or the virtual reality could be all about. And I hope that that's not a silly, old-fashioned way of idealizing what this technology will be used for. And I'm sure it'll be some mix of the two of those things. But at any rate, being in a place like this, seeing this, come to life, as it were, is just thrilling. It's absolutely amazing. So, really cool.
Yeah, it's one of those things where in principle, I would much prefer if if there was like an open source version of Roblox that was the monetization of Roblox is not really very intrusive for us because it's not like you have to, you don't pay to join, you don't pay to sign up for Roblox, so it isn't really influencing what we're doing so far. But it's just, unfortunately, people haven't been very successful in building voice apps online that are at a quality that is compatible with Zoom, just because the problems of designing software that does reliable, low latency, high quality voice chat is just really difficult and not something you can even really do as a small organization. As Matt's pointing out, to use voice chat, you are giving up some personal information, which does come with costs, particularly with the possibility of it being misused or leaked or stolen or whatever may happen. But yeah, like the infrastructure investment that Roblox is making, for example, just to make this voice chat work at scale and to make the places stream to you at low latency and all of that, it's really hard for open source to compete with. That's right. Or what is maybe pretty similar, if you're a Chinese citizen and you're overseas, you can't show Chinese ID to Roblox. They'll just say, get lost, you're Chinese, you can't use Roblox, which includes some of my own students, right? So we've had to find workarounds for that. So it's far from optimal, but as long as the benefits outweigh the costs for enough people, we'll keep doing it, and hopefully there are less intrusive ways of signing up for voice chat in the near term. That would be excellent. That's a good idea. I think, that's one of the ways in which open source needs a distributed way of collecting, coordinating, and deploying capital. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to compete with whether it's AI or metaverse or these new trends that are coming. We're going to see a new wave of ways of deploying immense amounts of capital, right? And the way in which open source or academia can't compete with companies for work on the metaverse or AI is going to come to many, many other areas of human activity. So I'm talking about building data centers. There's no, building a metaverse is not something that is just writing code. You need immense amounts of hardware. And Roblox is building their own data centers all around the world to make sure that there's low latency connections to as many users as possible. And those data centers communicate directly to each other at very high speed and that kind of thing. And that's, it's maybe not such a big problem to have 5 people in a world, but if you want to have 50 people in a world using voice chat and seeing the same things and interacting in a way that feels natural, this is a highly difficult distributed systems problem, which, maybe it's possible to solve it in an open source way, but it's not like writing a Linux kernel. This is a problem that I don't think has been solved in any comparable way outside of centralized control in large companies. Yeah, but the internet, what do you mean by the internet? You mean the protocols or the actual hardware? The landlines are owned by telecommunications companies largely, right? If there was a country in which the underlying fiber was somehow coordinated and deployed in a community fashion, then that would be analogous to the kind of investment that is required to have a truly open metaverse. I guess that's the direction which some of these crypto-related projects are trying to go, but they sort of seem to become very easily captured by kind of scammy, plant the flag, look to profit behavior. So I have high hopes for cryptocurrency as a new way of coordinating large systems of people doing good things, but so far I don't see a lot of evidence of that being done in good faith, unfortunately. Any points people want to bring up about the topics of today or questions? Yeah, that's right.
Um, I was wondering about, it's something we discussed maybe 2 or maybe 3 weeks ago. It's about sort of looking for signals from different groups about their point of view on when AI is going to be a thing, right? And I guess I was sort of thinking, I guess I haven't fully fleshed out these ideas, but even if you, say you think there's maybe a 5% chance AI will happen before 2030 or something like that, it still might make a lot of sense to have enormous investments, like very large investments in it, because the cost of missing out if you're wrong, or if you think the most likely scenario does play out, is much, much larger than the cost of losing your investment if what you see as the most likely scenario does play out. Yeah? You sort of...
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in a funny way, I haven't thought of flesh this thought out, but I think people might be misreading what's happening with Facebook/Meta. So like Mark Zuckerberg has talked about, they changed the name of the company and now it's about the metaverse and so on. But if you look at what they're actually doing, what they're doing is spending enormous amounts of money to buy GPUs. They have one of the largest supercomputers on Earth, thousands and thousands of the latest NVIDIA GPUs. So whatever they're doing with the metaverse, it involves, the metaverse as they see it will have a large AI component, right? You'll walk into a space and it will sort of build itself, in many ways be AI heavy. So you could say they're a metaverse company, but really it's, the asset they have is a lot of GPUs. So you could read what's going on with Facebook as being a large bet on AI, and of course the large tech companies are doing that. Tesla is kind of another big stock that's a bet on AI, not doing so well lately, I suppose. But yeah, I would expect, as you're saying, that as people's level of certainty about this rises, you'll see fairly crazy. It's already pretty crazy, the level of investment in AI companies. I don't know if you're reading it, but the Ian Hogarth and others, I forget their names, every year put out a State of AI report, which talks about the level of investment in AI startups and what's been happening, and the rush of funding it's hard to keep track of actually because it's happening in so many areas of science, but the level of investment in AI in pharmaceuticals, drug discovery, chemistry, material science is even in just over the last year has really skyrocketed, and also in biology, so in biotech, those companies are, there's a bit of a reckoning in biotech recently, but there's just in the last 6 months, I think 2 or 3 significantly funded startups looking to apply large language models, aka transformers, to drug design and protein design, synthetic biology, this kind of thing. So yeah, those bets are being made for sure.
I guess what I'm asking is, do some of those bets still make sense even if the people making them don't really believe that AI or AGI maybe is going to happen soon, just because
Yeah, I
they
think so.
know there's a chance they're wrong? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's probably how VCs think about it. I'm not sure they're sitting there thinking it's definitely going to be here by 2030. Yeah, that's right, as Matt says. The Dutch book justification of Bayesian probability is you believe whatever you're willing to bet. So I guess that's appropriate.
But it's weighted by the potential loss or payoff, right?
It's not that's just, right. Yeah.
Well, the other thing to think about And again, this is sort of like, this is what you don't encounter in any real world betting environment. Not real world, sorry, in any artificial betting environment, like in a casino, because the house is stacks odds against you. But you can imagine in the real world, maybe there's a roulette wheel that has 10 slots on it, and only one of them can win, but it's going to pay off 1,000,000 to 1, right? Of course, you put your money on all 10 because you can't lose, right? So if you think there are a small number, 10, for example, or maybe less, leading candidates who are likely to, crack the proverbial code on AGI, well, you simply bet on all of them. And it doesn't matter who wins. The fact that somebody is going to win is going to multiply your investment by more than the denominator you had to divide it across to invest in every single horse in the race. Does that make sense? So unlike betting in a casino, it can make sense to put money on every reasonably plausible candidate, and you can't lose. So that, to me, I think it's very likely that will happen if it isn't already certainly happening, or if it isn't certainly already happening already. The outliers there, the wild cards there, are that you can't invest in every one of these. For example, you can't invest in clandestine government projects that are aiming at developing AGI. So if such projects exist. So, but if you could, then it would be very rational, I think, to just spread your investment across the entire industry. And if you don't have to spread too thinly because there aren't that many horses that are in the race, well, then it's really hard to lose. So, yeah.
On that note, I think we'll wrap it up for today. Thanks, everyone. And
okay.
Yeah, we'll continue next week. And
Take care, guys.
In the code seminar coming up in 5 minutes in Discord, we're going to be plugging the AGI into MetaUni. And yeah, Matt's speaking in the SLT seminar this afternoon. So if you want to hear about his master's thesis, then do come along. All right, see you, everyone.